well, I'd like to welcome everyone here today. This is our bonus tour. I had first made it available to those who were on the commission and those who were on the society boards. And then last Sunday, those who came out for the cemetery tour, I decided to open it up so that we'd have a nice full house because I hadn't gotten an overwhelming response from the first people that I had invited. And we are so lucky to have Mr. Alan Poldy and his wife Martha, who is out there directing traffic. I believe you have arrived here in 2007.
Oh, no,
Close to
2011, actually.
2011, so they have been the caretakers of the property over these many years, living here, taking care as much as they can of all this vast landscape and building, and he does a fantastic job with the limited resources that he has. I have made some previous visits, and when weather was a little bit better. And in next year's series for the Historical Society, I am planning to do a program on the lost gardens of Hawthorne Hill, which we probably won't get to see very much of because it's raining out there today, but they were at one time a very magnificent showpiece. And people would come from all over the place to view them, and the Thayer family would make it open a certain time of the year so the townspeople could come up and take a tour because it was a very beautiful place to spend some time. This house was built by a member of the third generation. There are Thayers all over the state of Massachusetts, all over the country at this point in time. I think they first originally settled on the South Shore about 1640, and they moved their way in. This particular branch is the Lancaster branch. Started here in 1795 when they called the minister, Dr. Nathaniel Thayer, to become the sixth minister of the First Church of Christ, which is also known as the Bullfinch Church. And he had a parsonage located on the property where the music school, Thayer Performing Arts Center, is today. So he had his pastor. He passed away in 1840. He's buried across the street. Then his son, who had become fabulously wealthy in Boston in the railroads and the textile business in the expanding country, they were bankers, started the Boston Stock Exchange, for example, but loved Lancaster. So the son would come back frequently, instilled the love of the town in his own children. And he looked at the old parsonage and said, this is not suitable for my station in life. I want to make this my country seat and for my family, but it's not appropriate. So he had the old colonial style parsonage taken down, and in place of it he put up a Victorian villa, which looked very Victorian, and it's much smaller than the building that you see on site down in Lancaster today, the Yellow House. The two wings were added much, much later when his son then in turn inherited that house, another Nathaniel, the third Nathaniel. But anyway, these third generation sons grew into their wealth, they inherited the wealth, and probably none of them really had to ever go out and be gainfully employed because there would have been plenty of money to live on anyway, but they tried to find useful purposes for their lives. And Bayard Thayer, who was born in 1862, fraternal twin with John E. Thayer, decided that he would make horticulture his particular purpose in life. So, let's see. In the wintertime, the young boys would go to school in Boston. They lived on Chestnut Street on Beacon Hill. They went to the Hopkins School, spending the rest of the year in Lancaster. The two brothers and these two twin brothers, and the other house is down the hill, a Tudor-style house. Perhaps you saw as you came up the hill. It's privately owned today. That was the house of John E., but he's not our subject today. The two brothers owned a stud farm down where the end of Goss Lane is today. There were all kinds of barns there and all kinds of fields and training and exercise places there. It was called Maplehurst. Some of that's left today. They made history in the racing world. This was a gentleman's thing to do at the time. If you look at the magazine's Country Life, you'll see that everybody was raising and racing horses. They had a track over in Clinton near where St. John's Cemetery is today. Let's see, they raised also dogs, raised deerhounds, English bulldogs, and smooth fox terriers. in the house called Hillside. Now, Hillside is the today called Liberty Hill Farm. It's on the right-hand side as you go up the hill. It had a fire and it's being rebuilt. But that's where the twin brothers lived originally after they became of age and before they married. During his travels, I would like to say, the twin brother John E. went on to Harvard, as did his forebears. But Bayard, the man who built this house, decided that college education was not for him. So when he became of college age, he took a year off and made a trip around the world. He spent an entire winter in Japan, and he decided that the Japanese country was one of the most beautiful countries in the world, and the people of that country were one of the most civilized people. And then he developed this great interest in horticulture. And you can see they would bring a lot of plants over from the Orient. They tried to find all the plants they could that would grow in the New England climate. So he was known all over the world for that when he built the house in 1903. He called in a very, very famous professor. His name was Charles S. Sargent from the Arnold Arboretum. It's in Jamaica Plain today. Charles Sargent was his advisor in his choice of material, and Mr. Thayer in turn helped Professor Sargent on his many expeditions and excursions all over the United States and the world looking for plants. He wanted to have an extraordinary collection of them right here, not only plants, but trees. Trees were his big thing. And it's sad today to look at it because when I first visited, when I had a news writing assignment in college, way back when, the trees who were more magnificent, and now I drive by and they're hollow, empty stumps ready to fall down just about. But anyway, Mr.
Some
Thayer,
of them have given birth to new ones. So.
well, yeah, little pop trees, yeah, volunteer
I
trees.
just found some very interesting ones.
Yeah, but they're, yeah. So anyway, yeah, it's kind of sad, but then if there's rebirth, that's good too, but you'll have to nurture them along.
Yes.
Yeah, in 1896, Mr. Thayer married well within his class, because if you were a Boston Brahmin of the upper class, you married within your class. So he married a lady whose name was Ruth Simpkins. She was from New York City and Yarmouth Port on Cape Cod. She was independently wealthy. Her family also came from money. Her father was in the Hecula mining business, which I haven't really had time to research, but they obviously had some means. So Bayard and Ruth lived in Hillside for 7 years after the marriage, and then eventually built the house up here. They had 4 children. They had 1 son, 3 daughters. If you want a good look at their eldest son, all you need to do is go to the Thayer Memorial Library. Is it still there, Karen?
In the children's room?
In the children's room. That was their eldest son. He was Nathaniel 4. Unfortunately, he did pass away. I think it was probably leukemia. It was a diagnosis when he was a young man. But his mother, after Bayard's death, actually had that room on the library added in memory of her son, and that's why his picture hangs over the fireplace at the far end of the room. But while he was here, Mr. Thayer also decided to bring in ring-necked pheasants. Now, the pheasant wasn't a type of bird that was known in this area. He brought them in so that he could ask his fellow social people to come on over and have a pheasant shoot. So that's what they did. He was a sportsman, and he brought the pheasants in so they could have the pleasure of sport shooting. And of course, the pheasants now are fairly common in New England. Another thing, this is written by his daughter. Her name was Connie Dexter. She wrote it in 1964. I've edited some of it, so it makes it more pointed toward him. He was a road commissioner in Lancaster. He was a great, this is interesting, great advocate of the new treatment of dirt roads with tar and gravel instead of the old-fashioned spraying with crude oil to lay the dust, which ruined everyone's clothes and temper. So she thought her grandfather should be known for that. In 1928, Mrs. Bayard Thayer gave the children's room, and then during World War I, they used the house that is was opened up here for farming for war work and having crops grown, because during World War I, the entire country was all pulling together for the effort. They all wanted to defeat the enemy, and so she opened her property for that type of use. Sadly, in the 1940s, the children, her daughters, one had passed away. Another one stayed living here in town, but separated her time between here and Boston. And the other one lived on the North Shore. So, and times were hard, so the place fell into disuse. The hurricane of 1938 did a devastating job, wrought havoc with the stately trees in the mansion. A large group of rare trees to the south of the residence was completely leveled, and the forest to the north of the residence became a mass of tangled giants, ruining the shrine for birds and small wild animals. So that was kind of the end of the family's involvement, and that's kind of sad because they had the means at one time to keep it up, and they used only the finest materials to build this place. And at this point in time, the future's uncertain. It's been for sale. It's been used as a TM. I know that you're a TM practitioner as well as a high school principal in one of his former lives. At this point, are you going to be staying on for a long time to come, or we don't know?
We don't know.
Yeah, the future of this mansion is uncertain. Therefore, I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to have you all come in and see it, because we don't know. If you drive up on Hilltop Road, it's already being split into some house lots.
Yeah.
7 of them.
The main joy is walking around the building and seeing the great architecture that exists here while you still have a chance. We don't know who the new owner will be, and they may or may not be open to having the public look around. Just when I was doing some of this research, I just want to add a few little very interesting facts, little tiny points. This original Reverend Dr. Nathaniel Thayer, some say Unitarian, some say Universalist Christ Church, Congregational Unitarian, went through a split in those days, and so they were the Unitarian, not Trinitarian version.
And the group split away,
yes,
which became the Evangelical Congregational Church. They were the traditional ones.
Well, it wasn't evangelical like today's evangelical.
Yeah.
It was more conservative.
Yeah, and the Unitarians were.
Yeah.
It was a wave sweeping New England.
Yeah, liberal, open-minded kind of. Not that the others weren't necessarily open-minded, but maybe had a different look on things. Anyway, his wife, which we don't hear much about, I discovered, was the great-granddaughter of Paul Revere, which is a fascinating thing. It connects the history of Lancaster to certainly the whole United States. So there are lots of interwoven things here that show you, of course, the population of this area was very small compared to now. Now housing is lacking, actually. People are trying to find homes. That's why they're going up everywhere. There's just not enough, and not enough for all classes, poor and rich alike. Other interesting things is the architect, Guy Lowell. He was the same architect who did the center portion, the old portion of the Boston Museum of Fine Art, which is very well known in Massachusetts. And those from this area, the Worcester train station, Union Station, he did that beautiful thing beside the road. Same architect who did this building. And you go and there's this castle in the middle of, next to 290 there, which is just unbelievably beautiful. And they just recently renovated. They have proms and things there now. It's not just picking the bus up or something, but the horticulture aspect of this place, as Heather has noted, was very significant, as much, maybe if not more so, than the actual architecture. And this is the landscape architect. Actually, Guy Lowell was also a landscape architect, and he did a lot of the original planning. But Bayard Thayer passed away in 1916, and his wife worked with a man named William Anderson. And she and her husband had dreams about what they would do with the property. So she worked with this other landscaper or gardener or whatever, horticulturist, I guess is the proper title, to fulfill those dreams that her former husband had, her passed away husband. And so she worked for 20, 30 years fulfilling those dreams. So a lot of things that happened here in the gardens happened after Bayard Thayer passed. And they're quite extraordinary. Even these yew trees, these yew hedges have grown very high now. That is a Thayer species of yew that were developed on this property in conjunction with the Arnold Arboretum. So they were very much, they had, I think some of their camellia strains that they developed here, and his wife Ruth developed camellias. Some Tower Hill still has some of those. So there's lots of contributions that are sort of, you know, we walk around, we live our lives, and we live on the shoulders of others, and there's lots of little things, small things we may, but they've disappeared. Who were the originators of them? And it's nice to kind of recognize some of these interesting little things that weave time and history together. So he passed 1916, and Ruth Thayer passed in 1940. So there's a good space of time in between. Then the property, her estate, took over. Her daughter Helen was very generous, and because of her generosity, a lot of the things from the estate are now available to the public. Things were given to the library. Illuminated manuscripts that they had apparently copies of were donated to the appropriate libraries. Paintings, many of the things here that accumulated during the time of the...
Connie Dexter? Connie.
Helen, I think her name is. The daughter, one of the daughters, she died in 1943. Ruth. It was the same as her mother's name?
Mabel, Ruth, and Connie.
The one that died in 1943.
Yeah, that would be Ruth.
Oh, okay. So it was Ruth.
Ruth.
Yeah. So she donated many things to the community. And I guess she must have had her own means and necessarily didn't need these things. So it became part of history and available for other people to enjoy. So then in 1945, the Greek Orthodox Seminary was briefly the owners of the place, and now we see a whole stream of nonprofits coming because a lot of things happen in history. Income taxes are born following the Depression. They didn't exist before that in any extent whatsoever. Bank regulation didn't exist before that. They needed it because that's why all the banks collapsed. They didn't have regulation. Investment didn't have regulation, so all these regulations were there to safeguard the stability of our economy. But things changed, and means that the ultra-wealthy were still here, but not as many, and they weren't as wealthy as the very poorest. There was more of a middle class starting to develop. So things are changing, and so nonprofits came to own this property. So we'll just go through quickly. Greek Orthodox Seminary, Lancaster Institute, which is a horticultural organization, owned it for, 8 years, something like that, I mean, give or take. One of the most well-known is the Sterling-Lancaster Society. It was owned by nuns, a European order of nuns, and a lot of people still refer to this as the Senecal property because it existed for so long, it became the habit. And they had retreats here, and they built a whole wing on the other end. You'll see it, more of an institutional wing where the nuns would live a simple, not glorious 12.5-foot high.
A Spartan life.
Yes, a complete opposite of what this place represents.
Yeah.
And but then because they had retreats and they had a lot of people, actually a lot of people have stopped in here who attended those retreats. We have transcendental meditation retreats here now about 8 times a year. We have some people coming on those retreats who came on the Senecal Sister retreats when they were children living in Lancaster and Clinton. So things continue.
Generational.
Yes. And they owned it, they divided some of the rooms up. So the room numbers sometimes will skip a number. And that's because the room numbers are left, of course the Thayers wouldn't have had room numbers. I mean, we don't have them in our house, room 1, 2, 3, 4 like that. We might have, the mother's, father's room and the kid's room, but we don't put numbers on the doors. But when you're assigned a room at a retreat, then it's handy to have a room number. But they had more room numbers than there are rooms now, because those rooms have been dismantled, some of the ones that have been added, and made into large rooms again. So that's why when you go around and you see the numbers not sequentially, that's why they were left over. The Protestant and then the Senecals, like so many Catholic orders, there were less people volunteering to live that lifestyle, and so they were less people willing to support that lifestyle in terms of donations. So eventually they still exist, and there may be a few properties left in the United States, but more in Europe. So it's still an active society, but they may have gone into receivership, or it may have sold, but they really couldn't afford to keep it up. Then the Protestant Guild for the Blind, and I believe, I forget which denomination it is. It is now kind of converted itself slightly, but it's still a guild, and it's still a nonprofit, and it exists in Concord, Mass. But it was kind of a branch at that time here, and I think it was maybe located somewhere in the Boston area, and then moved to Concord later. But they attempted to have a school here, but they had a very hard time financially. And I've talked to some people who worked here during that time, and it was very difficult. A generous thing to do to make a school for the blind, but they were unable to do it, and they really had to scrape. And they had to cut a lot of corners and went into debt, and the place, they sold off a lot of the antiques that were remaining here, a lot of the furniture that were antiques. There's very few pieces left. And it's just the nature of how things go. They just couldn't afford to do it, and to pay their bills, they sold what they had. Then it went into receivership, and the TM organization bought it in 1979 at a great deal of a price, I'm sure. I don't know the exact number, but nothing. That's why nonprofits buy how they buy properties. It was the first location. I came here in 1981 just to teach a retreat, actually, a meditation retreat, so I'm familiar with what it looked like in those days. A year or two later, Dr. Deepak Chopra, who's known for spreading news about Ayurveda all across the world, he's a good friend with Oprah Winfrey and a guest on her show Untold Times, brought the term Ayurveda into usage, and he did very well here. He had lots of all the famous names, and a few of them get made up over time too. I hear all these names of people stayed here, which I check on them, and some of them didn't actually stay here, but some of them did. So we have people like, we are confirmed of George Harrison and Elizabeth Taylor and Michael Jackson and Barbra Streisand. And there's probably Mike Love of the Beach Boys stayed here. So those people we know for sure, and there's maybe some more, but some have been made up over time as well. As long with also the underground tunnels that connect all the Thayer Mansions. There's no truth to that whatsoever. No secret rooms. Okay. We just don't have any. So Deepak Chopra, he wrote a couple books. He became more famous and decided he'd make a higher income working for himself. So he left the TM organization and moved to California, and he still has his institute there. But he really learned Ayurveda within the TM organization. So back to the building itself, and then we'll walk around. There's lots of little details. So as you walk around, there's too many of you for us to talk to you while you're in the rooms. So I'll just tell you a few little things. In the back, over the fireplace, if you know Aesop's fables, that on the marble fireplace there's the fox and the swan, I guess? Crane. And they have this, if you remember the story, they invite each other to dinner. I don't know which one has the initial invitation, but one serves the soup in a flat dish, that the crane cannot eat the soup because it's in a flat dish. And so the fox serves it to the crane, but she or he can't eat it. And then the vice versa, it happens that it's also served next time in a long, narrow-necked kind of jar, and the fox has no way he can get his tongue in there, so he doesn't get to eat either. So it's a kind of an Asian theme of surface politeness, but underneath it there's animosity that is there, built into some very deep levels of nature. So there's fascinating little details like that around the building, and it gives you insight into the nature of the Thayer family and what they appreciated in their education. And the fireplace in the dining room also has this huge Greek, I think it's Greek or Roman, I'm not sure which, a story in huge detail. And there's some, I would have to take a scholar to sort it out, and it would be something fun to do, but I haven't done it. There's also the little fascinating things. Every fireplace has a little tiny white button next to it. And that's because they might have had coal here in the very first. There's a very old coal boiler for heat. But they use their fire, there's lots of fireplaces. And so if you were sitting in the room and you were a member of the first family and you needed wood, you push the little button and they run up and stoke the fire for you. So it's our equivalent of turning up the thermostat, except for it involved servants doing some legwork.
And this was a library, correct? The
A
library?
library, but I think it was a social room as well. They would have events in here. There's a closet there in the back corner that is a double door into another room, and that's more of a kind of probably an office for Bayard Thayer, and maybe we can see in our imaginations excusing themselves to talk business over cigars and brandy in that room, or something like that. But you can see when you walk in there, you'll see it's easy to imagine that kind of thing. The staircases that you'll see going to the third floor are not the original staircases. Neither of them are. The one on this end was probably mandated for the Catholic Church up here. It kind of fits in, but I know from working on the plaster and stuff, it's a different kind of plaster. It has metal lath, and they didn't use metal lath when they built this place. They used wood lath and horsehair plaster. It doesn't have horsehair plaster. It doesn't have metal lath. It was probably mandated because it was only one staircase to the third floor. But that one staircase also wasn't the original one. The original one went up what is now a staircase to the attic. So it was far set off from the main building, and the servants had to go up through the servants' quarters, not through the main house, to get to the third floor, to the more servants' quarters. Even though they were separate societies, they were a generous family, especially for their time, when there was a fair amount of nose in the air kind of attitude if you were upper class. And the others were less than human almost. Not quite, but they were a highly stratified society, but it was beginning to change, and the Thayers were, I think, really in the forefront. Ruth Thayer was also very involved with the Girl Scouts. And that was not that common for the wealthy either. You can't imagine camping and sitting outside, living in a tent, campfires, if you're upper class. But she donated lots of money to the Girl Scouts, worked with them. So you see a change starting to take place in society during the life of these people, more toward what we have now than what existed back then.
And she was together with her sister-in-law, who lived in the house right down. John He's wife is very well known also for working with the Girl Scouts.
Yeah.
And social services. She started social services.
Yeah. I talked to one woman who came by the property, and she can remember coming here with her grandfather in a hay cart, horse-drawn hay cart. And they would come here from somewhere, either North Lancaster or Bolton, maybe somewhere in that direction. And they came. She was, just maybe 1 or 3, maybe 4 years old, something like that, very young enough to sit on the cart without falling off. And she said they would come here because the Thayers had more hay than they could use, and they gave it to this family. So they'd come and get it. This was a hilltop pasture. There were no high trees when they built the house. And if you look at some of the old pictures, you can see that. You look and all the big trees are missing. And it's not as if they were taken down. They just weren't there. They were taken down 100 years before. Oh yeah, the latest history of Little Women that actually is coming to a theater near you on December 25th.
By Christmas, yes.
Some of it was filmed here. In this room was probably the longer scenes.
Wow.
So you'll see this tapestry up here, which is behind the TV. You'll see the candelabras, and this room filled with antiques, and not Meryl Streep, but most of the other movie stars were in here with them. Chris Cooper and all of them. You'll see them in here, and in the central reception area that you came into, the dining room they use. They have a very sober Christmas dinner in there. They see this little office next door, and then the bedroom at the far end on the first floor. There was a little scene in there. It was like a sitting room, and some of the formal gardens were used. There's a marriage proposal down there, and some other things. And then the coach house they turned into the Concord train station. So they put a sign over it.
Wow.
It was filmed at night. They had rain machines.
Wow.
Oh my God.
I didn't go to bed until 4 o'clock when the night they filmed that because
I do have to ask you, was Meryl Streep on this property?
she was not because these particular scenes, but the others were. And Martha, Martha knows their names better than I.
Laura Dern, of course.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah.
Emma
Watson.
Emma
Watson.
Watson.
Was Saoirse?
Florence Pugh. These are all their daughters.
Saoirse was one of the daughters. I think
There's
it's
one
one-
Yeah.
Australian, the
Yeah,
young one.
Saoirse.
Eliza Scanlon. And of course, Timothée Chalamet was
Oh,
the
yeah.
Laurie, young Laurie.
Yep.
And Chris Cooper plays his father or grandfather, I guess. And this was the interior of the Lawrence house. So they did not use this property for the March house. They used it for the Lawrence house. But the exterior shots in the movie were a different building.
Not even a building, a facade.
Yeah, well, for the big mansion, they used a different mansion. But the interior, some of the interior shots were done
It
here.
was a black facade, dark facade. It didn't have any building behind it.
That was the
It
March
was-
house.
Oh, really? Because that's why they painted the hallway black to match the black on the outside. No?
But you
Well-
got some new floors out of it, didn't you?
Yeah, the floors were actually when
It's
we had
pavement.
wall-to-wall carpet in this room. You could see where the pews used to be when this was a chapel.
Oh,
wow.
And they had a little dais down at that end, and you could all the rows where the pews were in here underneath. And they originally in the movie they actually didn't have this finished floor. They scraped it up and then put some finish on it, and it was okay for the movie. But we negotiated with them and didn't repaint the hallway out there to its original color in exchange for them finishing the floor. It's quite a these curtains are all courtesy of the movie. Silk curtains. The ones that were here were threadbare and in dire need of replacement. In all three of these rooms, actually 4 rooms, we got about $10,000 worth of silk curtains.
Excellent.
Courtesy of the movie.
Good bargaining.
Anyway, we want to go with you. I just want to say one thing. I just ask a few things. If you need to use the restroom, please use. There's just 2 of them that you should use. Otherwise, we have to clean all these rooms. There's one under the stairs, and then there's one in the little office room here on the side that's through that door. Or if you go into the stairs, one room straight ahead. There's 2 bathrooms you can use. If you want to go into the basement, which isn't ornate, it's a basement of an old building, please let me go with you because it's not sort of visitor safe in a way. It's not unsafe, but there's boards and paint and chainsaws, and I just want to. I'd rather be more comfortable liability-wise if we're with you if we go down there. It's not that you can't go. It's just I'd go with you.
Do you know the square footage of the building?
It's a little shy of 30,000 square feet.
And how many acres?
It's until a few months ago it was 217.
Now it's 210 according to the plan.
Okay.
Well, yeah, it's
210,
actually
yeah.
less than 200. Actually, there were
Yeah,
some mistaken
yeah.
numbers released.
Yeah.
There's 19 acres have been sold off, so now there's about 198 left.
They're going to sell any more off?
Yes.
Oh, you know very well.
It's divided into 4 parts. The lots on the Hilltop Road, that's one part, so most of that's gone. Then there is a subdivision planned out, which is, I don't know how many lots, 25, something like that, 26. And that's in the areas that aren't wetlands, just north of here. The main house and all the formal gardens and all that, excluding the coach house and the English garden, is about 60 acres. That's another section. And then the coach house and 5 acres are another part. So they did that because we're buyers for the whole thing, and they, again, it's a big property like all these nonprofits discovered. Every single one of them discovered the same thing. If you're not a Thayer with unlimited resources, it's too big a piece of property to maintain. You can't do it justice. It's not right to let it dissolve, and we hope that whoever takes it over, I mean, some people are not interested in restoring it, but we hope, personally, we have our own personal desires that somebody comes in, either restores it or at least keeps it in its current condition. But they'll have to make some change. There's some things, deferred maintenance, that needs to be done. Yeah.
Last question. What's the source of water for the property?
This is a very good question. It's a little point I wanted to share with you anyway. The source of water is a town water. It comes up through a pipe, though, that's this big. And nobody has a pipe that big delivering water to your house. And the reason is the first municipal water supply for the whole of Lancaster originated on this property. It was a well. They pumped the water up, and it was a gift to the town from this family. So the first municipal water supply wasn't something the town had to pay for. It was a big pipe that went down through, through the gardens here, down Bull Hill Road, essentially, down into the town, to South Lancaster. And it was a gift.
One of their many, many gifts.
One of their many.
Very public-spirited with their giving for the town.
Yes. And
Imagine. Nobody does that anymore.
Well, I mean, my personal
They paid the taxes.
prejudice is that this is a mandate for the wealthy. They really, if you are wealthy, your job is to share your wealth. To keep it to yourself and make it infinite without sharing it is just inhumane, given our current state of the world. But they were generous, which they deserve credit. Their memory deserves credit for. Public spirited, yes. Closed hallway here. Originally, the original house plans, one of the buyers spent money on research, and he found that this was closed in. And I would guess it was open, though, while the original owners had it. Some of the original owners did renovations here that were not recent. You know, even while they owned it, they changed it. They at one time they built a Greek temple, and they just in the garden, and they decided they didn't like it. They took it down. So it wasn't a static place at all. because, well, they heard the resources. So if they had a desire, it's not saving up your money to do it.
You just did it.
They just did it.
Try it out and see if you like it.
Yeah.